Hey guys, welcome to this video on testing in Python using Pytest. Testing helps to improve the quality of your code by ensuring that it behaves as you expect and continues to behave as expected when features are added, catching issues and bugs at an early stage, and overall simplifying the debugging process. In XP, we often follow the process of test-driven development, writing tests for a feature before we implement them. Writing tests before actually writing the code makes you think harder about the problem, as it makes you think about the expected behavior and helps to expose the edge cases. In a video to come, we'll talk about test-driven development, but in this video, we'll focus on how to install Pytest, how to write tests, and how to run them. So Pytest is a library in Python that lets you write tests. First, let's install this library using our package management tool, pip. So I've got a terminal open, and I'm going to type pip3 install Pytest. Cool, so I've installed Pytest. To verify that it was installed correctly, let's run a Python shell and try importing Pytest. Since this command ran without any errors, we know that Pytest was installed correctly. Before we try to run Pytest, I'm just going to make an empty test file in this directory. When you run Pytest, it looks for a file in the directory with a name that begins with test underscore. So I'm going to make a file called testexample.py. To run Pytest, you run python3-m pytest, followed by the name of your test file. So in this case, it's testexample. As you can see, it says no tests ran in 0.08 seconds, since there's no tests in this file, but we know that Pytest is successfully running. Now let's change testexample.py and actually make some tests. I've created a separate file called findhypotenuse.py that has one function in it, which, given the length of two sides of a triangle, finds the length of the hypotenuse. So it's just a simple function that returns the result of the calculation. This is the function we're going to try and test using Pytest. Over on the right hand side here in our test example file, we'll write the tests for this. So the first thing I want to do is actually import the function that I want to be testing from the other file. So I'll write from find hypotenuse, which is the name of the other file. I'll specify that I want to import the function. Now for Pytest, just as it looks for a file that begins with test underscore in the name, it also looks for functions which begin with test underscore in their names to look for the functions it needs to run when you run the pytest command. Each function runs as a separate test, and when you run it, it indicates which of the functions passed and which of the functions failed. So let's write one test for now. We'll call it test simple, since we'll just test a simple example of find hypotenuse. When we write our tests, we generally include a computation using the function that we're looking to test, and then we use the assert function, which is similar to assert in C, that ensures that the function has returned or behaved as we expect. So let's call our find hypotenuse function with the numbers 3 and 4. And now let's use the assert method to make sure that the return value is 5. On the left hand side, I'm going to try and run this file using python3-m pytest and test example like we saw before. As you can see, since we now have one test in this file, it's saying that one test passed, when before it was saying 0 tests passed. I'm going to create a second function that's the same as this function above, but instead of testing that the return value is 5, I'll test that it's 6, which is supposed to fail, just to show you what happens when a test fails in Pytest. So if we run the code again, so the bottom line now says 1 failed and 1 passed, since test simple passed but test simple 2 failed. And then the Pytest output for each failed test will tell you what the expected value was and what the actual value was. So it failed on the line that says assert that 5 equals 6, which wasn't true. When we have a more complex system with many classes, we may need to use a setup method to avoid initializing the same objects over and over again for each test. I've created a new example called library.py over here on the left, that has a class called library that stores a list of staff and a list of books. So down the bottom here we have the staff class that has a name and a time employed attribute. And then at the very bottom we have a book class that stores a title and a description. In the library we have two functions. One is called find book that returns a book given a title. And then the other one is called find longest employee that will return out of the list of employees the one who has been employed for the longest. So these are the two functions that we want to test, and I'll demonstrate how we can write some more complex Pytests. So I've created a new test file called test library over on the right hand side, and I've imported the classes that we're going to need to make the tests. Say I wanted to create a library which stored some staff and books that I wanted to be able to reference from each test. I wouldn't simply be able to make these global variables, since when Pytest runs each function, it runs each in isolation as a unit test and it doesn't give you access to the global variables in that file. However, Pytest does provide us with a way that we can create a setup method and then store any of the instances or data that we need to run the rest of the tests. To do this, we create a class. I'm going to call this class test library. And then inside this class, we have a function called setup method, where we can create instances for the test library class, which we can then access in the rest of our tests. In this setup method, I'm going to create a library and create some staff and books to store in that library. So I just quickly implemented some content for the setup method. So what I've done is created 3 books with titles and descriptions, and then created a list called books out of these 3 books. And then I did the same with staff. So I made 4 staff instances and created a list called my staff. Then I created an attribute, my library, which created a library instance using these 2 lists. So now when I create several Pytests, I have access to self.mylibrary and don't need to create a new library for every single test. Let's now start writing tests for the find book and find longest employee methods. I'll start by writing a test for the find book function. So just like before, the functions need to start with the word test underscore, and I'll call this one find book. Now I'm going to call the function we want to test, which is find book, and then we want to assert that the return value was the correct book. Alright, first I've got to make sure I'm calling my library on self. I forgot to put that there first. So we call the find book method on self.mylibrary. Now let's run this code over on the left-hand side to make sure that it works. Great, as you can see, we have 1 test passed. When we write tests, it's also important to test for edge cases. So let's write a test to make sure that nothing is returned when we try to find a book with a title that we don't have in the library. So I've called the function test find book fail since we expect it to not find a book, and I'm just going to do a really similar thing to the last test except assert that the result was none. Now let's run this code again. Great, so 2 tests are now passing. Finally, let's write a test for our find longest employee function. So we'll call the function and make sure that it's returned the right employee. So in this case, the result should be Hus. Great, so I added this test. I also quickly added a getName function in staff to make sure that we weren't breaking encapsulation. So now let's try to run this code again. Awesome, so as expected, we have 3 tests passing. Alright guys, that's it for this video on how you can write Pytest for the simple and complex examples. Thanks for listening.